Hello and welcome to LPBW Update, your number one source for the latest news, in-depth analysis, and exclusive theories surrounding little people, big world. Today, we are bringing you a report that is nothing short of a bombshell. What we are about to discuss is based on insider reports and a developing theory that pieces together a puzzle so shocking it could redefine the entire Roloff family narrative. We're talking about a story of high-stakes legal battles, secret meetings, and a desperate act that borders on the criminal. At the center of it all is a courtroom drama so intense it makes the on-screen arguments look like child's play. The premise is devastating. Sources are alleging that Caryn Chandler, in a bid to secure Matt Roloff's legal victory over Amy, paid a former employee to commit perjury and lie about Amy under oath. This isn't just about family drama anymore. This is a report about a potential felony. Before we dive deep into the tangled web of this explosive report, we need your help to keep bringing you this kind of in-depth content. If you believe in getting to the bottom of what's really happening behind the scenes, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to LPBW Update, and ring the notification bell. Your support is what fuels our investigation, and you won't want to miss a single update on this developing story. Now, let's get into the details of the scandal that could rock the Roloff dynasty to its core. To truly understand the gravity of this situation, we must first revisit the context of the farm's final business division. This isn't just about selling a piece of land. It's about dismantling a legacy built over 3 decades. The central conflict, as viewers are well aware, revolves around the valuation of Amy Roloff's shares in Roloff Farms. Her legal team has been steadfastly arguing that her contribution was far more than just a financial stake. They are fighting for the recognition of her sweat equity, a term that encapsulates years of tireless work, foundational ideas, and the emotional labor that transformed a simple plot of land into the beloved attraction it became. Amy's lawyers contend that she was not a silent partner, but a co-creator, the driving force behind pumpkin season's success, the face of the farm tours, and the heart of the family business. Her involvement, they argue, was integral to the brand's identity and its financial success, and therefore her buyout should reflect that foundational role. On the other side of the aisle, Matt Roloff's legal team, reportedly with Caryn Chandler acting as a key strategist behind the scenes, is pushing a starkly different narrative. Their argument is designed to systematically dismantle the concept of Amy's sweat equity. They are painting a picture of her as a minor contributor, someone whose role was exaggerated and whose operational input was minimal. They claim Matt was the sole visionary, the architect of every project, the engine of the farm's growth. According to their position, Amy's contributions were largely domestic and administrative, not foundational to the business's core success. The goal is clear: to devalue Amy's historical input and, in doing so, drastically reduce the final settlement figure. This legal battle has become a war over history itself, a fight to define who truly built the Roloff empire. The financial stakes are massive, but for Amy, the personal stakes, the validation of her life's work, are even higher. It is within this high-pressure, emotionally charged environment that our insider reports suggest Caryn Chandler made a move of pure desperation. With the legal proceedings potentially not leaning in Matt's favor, and with Amy's lawyers making a compelling case for her sweat equity, Caryn allegedly decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed an ace in the hole, a piece of evidence so powerful it could shatter Amy's claims. But where would she find such a thing? The answer, according to our sources, was to manufacture it. The plan was as cynical as it was dangerous. Find a disgruntled former employee, someone with a grudge and a need for cash, and turn them into a weapon against Amy. Caryn allegedly began to quietly search for a specific type of person, not just any farmhand, but someone who had left the farm on bad terms, someone who harbored resentment, particularly towards Amy. Our sources indicate that her search led her to a man who was fired from Roloff Farms several years ago. The reason for his termination was reportedly severe misconduct, an issue on which Amy had been particularly firm. She had advocated for his dismissal, citing a breach of trust and a pattern of irresponsible behavior. Matt, who sometimes has a softer spot for his workers, might have been hesitant, but Amy's conviction won out. This created the perfect storm of resentment. The former farmhand didn't just lose a job, he felt personally wronged by Amy Roloff. He became the ideal candidate for Caryn's alleged scheme, a man with a motive for revenge and a perceived credibility of having been an insider on the farm for years. The next step in this reported conspiracy was the secret meeting. Caryn couldn't risk being seen with this individual. The entire plan depended on absolute secrecy. Our sources describe a clandestine rendezvous at a discreet, out-of-the-way diner far from the familiar territories of Hillsborough. It was here in a dimly lit booth that the alleged deal was struck. Caryn, operating with a mix of charm and calculation, supposedly laid out her offer. She offered him a significant sum of cash, we're hearing figures in the tens of thousands of dollars, in exchange for his testimony. It wasn't just a payment, it was a life-changing amount for someone likely struggling financially since his dismissal. But the money came with a script. This wasn't about him recalling his own memories. It was about him adopting a narrative crafted by Caryn. The coaching session was allegedly meticulous. Caryn fed him the precise talking points designed to inflict maximum damage on Amy's legal case and personal reputation. The narrative was simple and damning. He was to portray Amy as lazy, a stark contrast to the hard-working image her fans and family knew. He was instructed to create a picture of her as someone who was never working in the fields, who would stay in the main house while Matt and the crew toiled under the sun. He was coached to say she was disconnected from the day-to-day operations, treating the farm more like a backdrop for the television show than a functioning business. Another key point was to paint her as an obstacle to progress, someone who was constantly undermining Matt's vision. He was given specific, albeit fabricated, anecdotes to recite, stories of her shooting down Matt's innovative ideas, complaining about the costs of new projects, and creating a negative atmosphere among the staff. Every detail was designed to corroborate the legal team's argument that Amy was not a partner, but a hindrance. The farmhand was, in essence, being trained to deliver a performance, a false but detailed account that would seem utterly credible to anyone who didn't know the truth. The day of the deposition arrived, and it unfolded exactly as Caryn had allegedly planned. A deposition is a formal, pre-trial testimony given under oath. Lying in a deposition is perjury, a serious crime. The room was tense, filled with lawyers, a court stenographer, Matt, and a visibly anxious Amy. When the former employee was called to testify as a witness for Matt's side, Amy was reportedly confused. She remembered him, of course, and the circumstances of his firing, but she could not have anticipated what was about to happen. Under oath, the man began to speak, and a torrent of carefully rehearsed lies filled the room. He delivered his performance flawlessly. He spoke with a convincing blend of feigned reluctance and righteous indignation, as if he were a man simply telling the hard truth. He recounted his fabricated memories with stunning detail. He described specific dates during pumpkin season when Amy was allegedly absent from the patch for days on end, leaving the staff to handle the chaos. He told a story about a major tractor breakdown where Amy supposedly complained about the repair costs rather than helping find a solution. He claimed to have overheard her referring to Matt's ambitious building projects like the Western Town as Matt's silly hobbies that were draining the farm's resources. He painted a vivid picture of a deeply uninvolved and often critical partner, a woman who reap the benefits of the farm's success without contributing her fair share of the labor or the vision. The level of detail was what made the testimony so venomous and so effective. He didn't just make general statements. He provided a rich tapestry of lies that felt real. The impact on Amy was immediate and devastating. She was blindsided, shocked into silence. To hear these calculated falsehoods about her life's work, spoken with such confidence by someone she had once employed, was a profound betrayal. Her legal team was equally stunned. They were prepared to argue about business valuations and profit and loss statements, not to combat a character assassination built on a foundation of pure fiction. The hired gun's testimony was a direct, brutal assault on the core of their case, the concept of Amy's sweat equity. If he was to be believed, her sweat equity was a myth. The testimony threatened to completely derail their strategy and, more consequentially, to drastically reduce Amy's final settlement. At that moment, it seemed that Caryn's high-risk gamble had paid off. The false testimony hung in the air, credible and corrosive, and the scales of justice appeared to be tipping dangerously in Matt and Caryn's favor. The carefully constructed narrative was working, and Amy's legacy was on the verge of being rewritten by a paid liar. The aftermath of that deposition was a period of turmoil and disbelief for Amy and Chris. Amy knew with every fiber of her being that the testimony was a lie. She had lived those years. She had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into that farm. The stories the man told were not just inaccurate, they were the polar opposite of reality. Chris, who had witnessed Amy's dedication firsthand, even in the later years on the farm, was furious. He saw the toll the testimony took on Amy, the hurt, the anger, the feeling of helplessness against such a brazen attack. They both knew this wasn't just a case of a disgruntled employee with a faulty memory. The performance was too polished, the details too specific, the alignment with Matt and Caryn's legal strategy too perfect. This had the stench of a coordinated conspiracy. They refused to let this stand. They knew they had to fight back, not just for the money, but for the truth of Amy's life's work. Their first instinct was to rely on their own memories and the testimony of others who had been there. But it would be their word against his. In a legal setting, a sworn testimony, even a false one, carries significant weight. They needed more than just a rebuttal. They needed concrete, irrefutable proof of a conspiracy. They needed to prove not just that he was lying, but why he was lying. This is when the decision was made, a crucial turning point in this entire saga. Amy and Chris decided to go on the offensive. They pooled their resources and made a critical investment in the truth. They hired a private investigator. This wasn't a decision made lightly. It was an admission that they were no longer just in a business dispute. They were in a dirty fight, and they needed to use the tools of such a fight to defend themselves. The private investigator they hired was reportedly a seasoned professional, a specialist in financial forensics and surveillance. He was methodical, discreet, and highly effective. Amy and Chris provided him with everything they knew: the man's name, his last known address, and the date of his damning testimony. They voiced their suspicion that he had been paid off, likely by Caryn, who they saw as the strategic force behind Matt's increasingly aggressive tactics. The investigators' mission was clear: dig into this man's life, find his secrets, and uncover any evidence of collusion. He was to operate in the shadows, to follow the money, and to find the link that would expose the entire scheme. The PI immediately went to work, and according to our sources, the trail was not hard to find. People who suddenly come into large sums of cash are often not very careful about hiding it. The investigator started with a comprehensive background check. He looked at the man's financial history, his employment records since being fired from the farm, and his known associates. The man was not living a life of luxury. He had a history of spotty employment and was, by all accounts, struggling financially. This made him a prime target for a bribe. The investigator then began scrutinizing his recent financial activities, focusing on the weeks leading up to the deposition. And that's when he hit the jackpot. Just 2 days after the alleged secret meeting with Caryn, and a few days before he delivered his testimony, the former farmhand had made a large, unexplained cash deposit into his personal bank account. The amount was significant enough to raise a red flag. It was far more than he could have possibly earned from any legitimate work. And because it was a cash deposit, it was difficult to trace its origin directly, but its timing was incredibly suspicious. This was the first piece of hard evidence, the smoke that suggested a fire was burning nearby. A man with no money suddenly has a lot of it, right before he is scheduled to give a testimony that benefits the very people with the means to pay him. It was a classic pattern in cases of bribery and witness tampering. But the PI needed more than just a suspicious deposit. He needed to connect the money to its source. He needed to place the farmhand and Caryn Chandler in the same place at the same time. The investigator began canvassing the area around the man's home and known hangouts. He interviewed people discreetly, asking about any unusual activity. His real breakthrough, however, came from old-fashioned surveillance work, combined with a bit of modern technology. He pulled traffic camera footage and security camera footage from businesses in the vicinity of the discreet diner that sources had tipped them off about. It took hours of painstaking work, sifting through low-resolution videos. But then he found it. A grainy but clear image from a gas station security camera across the street from the diner. The footage showed Caryn Chandler's distinctive vehicle pulling into the diner's parking lot. Minutes later, the former farmhand's truck pulled in and parked bikes a few spaces away. The timestamp on the video corresponded exactly with the day of the alleged secret meeting. The final damning piece of evidence came from the diner itself. Posing as a customer, the investigator spoke with a waitress who had been working that night. He showed her photos of Caryn and the farmhand. The waitress remembered them. She recalled them sitting in a corner booth, speaking in hushed, serious tones for over an hour. She remembered thinking it was an odd pairing. Most importantly, she remembered them leaving separately, and she remembered the man leaving a surprisingly large cash tip. While this wasn't proof of a payoff, it placed them together, having a secret meeting just days before the deposition and just before a large sum of cash appeared in his bank account. The investigator now had a chain of evidence. The motive, a disgruntled employee; the meeting, confirmed by video and a witness; the money, a suspicious cash deposit; and the crime, the false testimony. The web of lies was beginning to unravel. With this arsenal of evidence, Amy's legal team prepared for their counterattack. The mood in their camp had shifted from despair to a steely resolve. They now held the key to not only discrediting the false testimony, but also to exposing a criminal conspiracy. The next legal proceeding was scheduled, and they were ready. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with tension. Matt and Caryn, likely feeling confident after their previous success, were unprepared for the reversal of fortune that was about to occur. Amy's lawyer began his presentation not by questioning the details of the farmhand's testimony, but by questioning the witness's very credibility and integrity. He calmly and methodically began to lay out the evidence the private investigator had uncovered. He started by presenting the man's certified bank records, highlighting the large out-of-place cash deposit. He asked the man, who was once again under oath, to explain the source of these funds. The man stammered, offering a weak and unbelievable story about a lucky gambling win. The lie was transparent, and his nervous demeanor was a stark contrast to the confident performance he had given during the deposition. Then Amy's lawyer played the security footage. He presented a large, clear still image of Caryn Chandler's car and the farmhand's truck in the diner parking lot. He submitted the time-stamped video as evidence. The camera in the courtroom would have panned to Caryn, whose face would have undoubtedly turned pale. The secret meeting was no longer a secret. Finally, the lawyer submitted a sworn affidavit from the diner waitress corroborating their meeting. He presented the evidence as a cohesive, undeniable narrative. He painted a picture of a conspiracy, of a witness who had been paid to lie. He laid out the timeline, the secret meeting with Caryn, the sudden influx of cash, and the subsequent damning testimony against Amy. He directly accused the man of perjury and Caryn Chandler of suborning perjury, the act of persuading or inducing another person to commit the crime of perjury. He then turned to the judge and stated that, given the evidence, his client was formally requesting that the district attorney's office open a criminal investigation into witness tampering and perjury. The weight of the evidence, combined with the threat of serious criminal charges, was too much for the former employee to bear. The prospect of going to prison for Caryn Chandler was a far cry from the easy payday he had envisioned. His carefully constructed composure shattered. Faced with undeniable proof and the looming threat of years behind bars, he cracked. The courtroom witnessed a stunning confession. The man admitted, through tears and apologies, that his entire testimony had been a lie. He confessed that he had been contacted by Caryn Chandler. He admitted to the secret meeting, the coaching, and the cash payment. He told the court that Caryn had provided him with the specific stories and phrases to use against Amy. He confessed to everything. The confession was a legal nuclear bomb. The immediate consequence was the complete and utter destruction of Matt's legal case. The star witness for his side was now an admitted perjurer, and the testimony that had so threatened Amy's settlement was struck from the record, rendered entirely worthless. In fact, it did worse than that. It actively backfired. The act of bringing a paid liar to a legal proceeding demonstrated bad faith of the highest order. It poisoned their entire position. The judge was reportedly furious, and the legal foundation for devaluing Amy's sweat equity crumbled into dust. Not only was Amy's original claim now likely to be upheld, but she might even be in a position to receive punitive damages due to the malicious and illegal tactics used against her. But the fallout extended far beyond the family's civil dispute. This was no longer just about the farm. The act of suborning perjury is a serious felony. Caryn Chandler, by paying and coaching a witness to lie under oath, had allegedly committed a crime. The man's confession implicated her directly as the architect of the conspiracy. The courtroom drama instantly transformed into a criminal matter. The revelation exposed Caryn not just as a manipulative partner in a family squabble, but as a potential felonious conspirator. The scandal was no longer a private family affair to be debated by fans of a reality show. It was a public crime documented in court records and destined to become front-page news. The shockwaves from this one desperate act threatened to bring down everything Matt and Caryn had been building, creating a massive scandal that would leave an indelible stain on the Roloff family legacy forever. The fight for the farm had escalated into a fight for freedom, and Caryn Chandler was now at the center of a criminal investigation that could change her life and the lives of everyone around her permanently. The carefully laid plan to diminish Amy's past had exploded, threatening to obliterate Caryn's future. The truth, once suppressed, was now out, and its consequences would be swift and severe. The immediate aftermath of the confession was pure chaos. Imagine the scene. A hushed courtroom erupts into a cacophony of frantic whispers. Lawyers from both sides are on their feet, some shouting objections out of sheer reflex, others simply staring in stunned silence. The court stenographer's fingers are flying, trying to capture the torrent of admissions from the weeping witness. At the center of it all is the judge, whose face has transformed from professional impassivity to a mask of cold fury. This is no longer a civil proceeding about property valuation. His courtroom has been turned into the scene of a serious crime, and his authority has been flagrantly disrespected. Let's focus on the key players in that room. On one side, you have Amy and Chris. For Amy, this moment is a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. There's the profound, bone-deep relief of vindication. The truth is out. Her life's work, her integrity, has been affirmed in the most dramatic way possible. But beneath that relief is a layer of deep sadness and horror. This isn't a victory to be celebrated. It's a tragedy. To see the lengths to which her ex-husband's partner would go to destroy her, to realize the depth of the animosity. It's a wound far deeper than any financial dispute. Chris is by her side, a pillar of support, his hand on her shoulder. His expression is one of grim satisfaction. He has protected Amy, he has helped her fight for the truth, and now they have been proven right. Then you have Matt and Caryn. Our sources describe Matt as being utterly blindsided, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. It's as if the world has tilted off its axis. He looks from the confessing witness to Caryn, searching for an explanation, for some sign that this is all a terrible misunderstanding. But he finds no comfort there. Caryn, the woman who had been his strategic rock, his confidant, is now the epicenter of a legal earthquake. Her composure has completely shattered. The confident, in-control woman who managed the farm and Matt's life is gone. In her place is a person staring into an abyss. Her eyes are locked on the witness, her expression a cocktail of terror and disbelief that her plan has not just failed, but has imploded in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Her own lawyers are keeping their distance, a clear sign that they are already contemplating the ethical and legal nightmare she has just created for them. The collapse of Matt's civil case was immediate and absolute. In legal terms, the doctrine of unclean hands comes to mind. This principle essentially states that a plaintiff who has acted unethically or in bad faith in relation to the subject of a lawsuit cannot then seek equitable relief. By bringing a paid, perjuring witness to court, Matt's side had demonstrated the dirtiest hands imaginable. Amy's legal team, seizing the moment, would have immediately filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the defendant's case was now irrevocably tainted and built on a foundation of fraud. The judge, incandescent with rage at the deception perpetrated in his court, would almost certainly grant it. The entire negotiation over the farm's value would be reset, but this time, Amy would hold all the cards. Her lawyers would argue compellingly that this act of desperation was proof that Matt and Caryn knew their own valuation was weak and that Amy's sweat equity claim was strong. They couldn't fight her claim on the facts, so they resorted to manufacturing lies. This puts Amy in a position of incredible power. Her team could now demand a settlement far exceeding their original asking price. They could argue for punitive damages, a monetary award designed not to compensate for a loss, but to punish the defendant for egregious misconduct. The court would be highly sympathetic to such a request. The goal is no longer just to get Amy a fair price, it's to make an example of Matt's side for their attempt to corrupt the judicial process. The final settlement would not just be a financial transaction, it would be a judicial rebuke of their actions. But the civil case, as financially significant as it is, was now a secondary concern. The real drama had shifted to the criminal arena. As soon as the confession was uttered, the judge would have ordered the testimony to be sealed and a transcript sent directly to the district attorney's office. This is not a matter of if they will investigate. It is a certainty. A crime was confessed to under oath in open court. The wheels of criminal justice would begin to turn immediately. Let's break down the potential charges, because this is where the situation escalates from a reality TV scandal to a potential prison sentence. The farmhand, the hired gun, is facing a charge of perjury. In most states, this is a felony, punishable by several years in prison. However, because he confessed and is now the star witness against the person who allegedly orchestrated the crime, he is in a prime position to cut a deal. Prosecutors would likely offer him a significantly reduced sentence, perhaps even just probation, in exchange for his full, detailed, and truthful testimony against Caryn Chandler. Caryn's legal jeopardy is far more severe. The primary charge against her would be subornation of perjury. This is the crime of persuading, inducing, or procuring another person to commit perjury. It is legally considered a more serious offense than perjury itself because it involves a deliberate corruption of the justice system. It's not just lying, it's masterminding the lie. This charge alone can carry a lengthy prison sentence. But it likely wouldn't stop there. Prosecutors could also pursue charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice. They would argue that Caryn and the farmhand entered into an illegal agreement with the specific intent of impeding a legal proceeding. This adds another layer of criminality and another potential felony conviction. Furthermore, depending on how the cash was handled, there could even be financial crimes involved, like money laundering, though that might be harder to prove. The bottom line is that Caryn Chandler would be facing a multi-count felony indictment, a legal battle that could consume years of her life and potentially end with her behind bars. This brings us to the most complex and tragic figure in this entire reported drama, Matt Roloff. The billion-dollar question that insiders are fiercely debating is, what did Matt know and when did he know it? There are two prevailing theories, each with devastating implications. The first theory paints Matt as a victim of his own blind trust. In this version of events, Matt was completely unaware of Caryn's scheme. He has always been the big ideas guy, the dreamer, while Caryn evolved into the pragmatist, the one who handled the details and, in this case, the dirty work. She saw the legal battle going poorly, and in a misguided attempt to protect Matt and their future, she went rogue. She convinced herself that the ends justified the means, that securing the farm for Matt was worth any risk. She found the disgruntled farmhand, made the payment, and coached him, all without Matt's knowledge. She might have told Matt that a helpful former employee had come forward, but she would have omitted the illegal details. In this scenario, Matt's shock in the courtroom was genuine. He was watching not only his legal case, but his entire life with Caryn disintegrates before his very eyes. The woman he loved and trusted had betrayed his confidence, the law, and the very essence of fairness. This would leave Matt in an impossible position, heartbroken, humiliated, and legally tethered to a woman now branded as a felon. His reputation would be tarnished by association, and he would be forced to choose between standing by the woman he loves and condemning her criminal actions. The second theory, however, is far darker and, according to some cynical insiders, more plausible. This theory posits that Matt was, at the very least, complicit. He may not have been in the diner making the deal himself, but he knew what Caryn was doing. Perhaps he didn't ask for the details because he didn't want to know. It was a case of willful blindness. Caryn might have said something like, "Don't worry, Matt, I'm taking care of it. I found a way to handle Amy's ridiculous claims." And Matt, desperate to win, chose not to ask any further questions. He wanted the result and was content to let Caryn handle the messy methods. If this is true, then Matt is not a victim but a co-conspirator. While he might not be charged criminally if his involvement can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, he would be morally and ethically culpable. The farmhand, under his plea deal, would be intensely questioned about any and all contact he ever had with Matt. Any phone call, any text message, any overheard conversation could potentially draw Matt into the criminal investigation as well. This theory suggests that the pressure of losing the farm, of losing to Amy, had corrupted them both, leading them down a path from which there was no return. Regardless of which theory is true, the impact on the Roloff children would be catastrophic. This scandal transcends the existing family fractures. It is a seismic event that would permanently alter the family landscape. For Zach and Tori, who are already estranged from Matt and Caryn over their own failed farm deal, this would be a horrifying validation of their feelings. They likely already saw Caryn as a manipulative influence, someone who had driven a wedge between them and their father. This news would confirm their worst fears in the most public and damning way imaginable. It would cement their decision to keep their distance, not just for their own peace of mind, but to protect their children from such a toxic environment. The pain for Zach would be immense. To see his father embroiled in a criminal scandal orchestrated by his partner is a family wound that may never heal. For Jeremy and Audrey, who have also cultivated a life separate from the farm's drama, this news would be equally devastating. They have worked hard to build their own brand based on faith, family, and intentional living. To have the Roloff name dragged through the mud in a felony criminal case would be a significant blow. They would be forced to navigate an impossible situation: how to support their father in his time of crisis while unequivocally condemning the illegal and immoral actions that led to it. We can imagine countless tense phone calls, tears, and a profound sense of disillusionment. The dream of their children growing up with their cousins on Roloff Farms, a dream that was already fading, would be extinguished forever, replaced by the harsh reality of court dates and potential prison sentences. Molly, who has always kept her life intensely private, would be horrified by the public spectacle. And Jacob, the family's most outspoken critic, would likely see this as the ultimate indictment of the fame and greed that he believes corrupted his family. He might feel a sense of vindication for his earlier critiques of the show and the lifestyle it promoted, but it would be a hollow victory, tainted by the deep and public suffering of his family members. The scandal would force all four children to reevaluate their relationship with their father and to form a united front, not against him, but against the public fallout and the deep internal damage this has caused. The trust that once formed the foundation of their family would be shattered into a million pieces. The public relations fallout would be an uncontrollable inferno. The story is simply too sensational to be contained. Headlines would scream from every tabloid and celebrity news site: Roloff Farm scandal, witness bribed in vicious divorce battle. Little people, big world stars partner accused of felony conspiracy. Caryn Chandler facing prison time for a perjury scheme. The narrative of the wholesome, hardworking family on the farm, a narrative that TLC has cultivated for over a decade, would be obliterated overnight. The show, Little People, Big World, would be in immense peril. How could the network possibly continue filming? The central storyline would no longer be about pumpkin season or Matt's latest building project. It would be about a criminal trial. They couldn't ignore it, but filming it would be a logistical and ethical nightmare. This scandal would likely be the death knell for the show. TLC would be forced to issue statements, distance themselves from the controversy, and likely cancel the series that made the Roloffs famous. This brings us to the future of Roloff Farms itself. The farm is more than just land and buildings. It's a brand, a tourist destination. But now it's tainted. It's the backdrop for a criminal conspiracy. Would families still want to bring their children to a place associated with such a bitter and illegal feud? The brand would be severely damaged, perhaps irreparably, and Matt's ability to run it would be completely compromised. He would be consumed by the legal and personal drama. Furthermore, the newly empowered Amy, during the settlement negotiations, could force the sale of the entire property as a condition of the deal. She might want to wash her hands of it completely, to sever all ties with the place that now holds such painful memories. Matt's dream, the legacy he wanted to pass down to his children, would be lost, not because of a business disagreement, but because of a desperate criminal act committed in his name. Finally, we must consider the fate of Caryn Chandler. Her journey from farm manager to Matt's partner to the matriarch-in-waiting of the Roloff dynasty would come to a screeching, disastrous halt. She would be facing a public shaming of epic proportions, followed by a grueling and expensive criminal defense. Her relationship with Matt would be tested to its breaking point. Even if he believes she did it for him, the consequences of her actions are so catastrophic that it's hard to see how their partnership could survive. She would lose her standing in the community, her role on the show, and potentially her freedom. The gamble she took, born out of a desire to secure her and Matt's future, would have achieved the exact opposite. It would have destroyed that future completely, leaving a trail of wreckage that would impact every single member of the Roloff family for years to come. The courtroom drama is over, but the real-life tragedy is just beginning. What started as a fight over money and legacy has now devolved into a desperate battle for reputation, freedom, and the very soul of a family. The confession was not an ending, it was a detonator. The blast in that courtroom blew apart a family, a business, and a television legacy. But what happens after the smoke clears? What happens when the dust settles on the wreckage of lies and betrayal? Welcome back to LPBW Update, where we are following the insider reports on the scandal that has turned the world of little people, big world upside down. Today, we delve into the aftermath, the fallout, and the legal firestorm that is just beginning to gather strength. We are moving past the initial shock and into the cold, hard reality of consequences. The story from here on out is one of public humiliation, frantic legal maneuvering, and a family grappling with a wound so deep it may never truly heal. The first consequence was the one that couldn't be contained: the leak. Courtrooms, especially in high-profile civil cases that suddenly turn criminal, are notoriously porous. It only took a few hours for the story to break. It likely started with a single anonymous source, a clerk, a paralegal, someone in the room who understood the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. They tipped off a local reporter or a national tabloid, and from there, it spread like wildfire. The initial headlines were explosive, almost too sensational to be believed. Roloff star's fiance bribed witness. Little people, big world scandal. Felony charges loom in farm battle. Amy Roloff, the victim of criminal conspiracy. Within 24 hours, it was the lead story on every entertainment news outlet in the country. TMZ, Page 6, People magazine, they were all over it, publishing the salacious details of the courtroom confession. The narrative was simple, brutal, and compelling. It had everything: a beloved TV family, a bitter divorce, a scheming new partner, and a stunning courtroom confession. The public's perception of the Roloff family, carefully curated over more than a decade by TLC, was shattered in an instant. The wholesome image of pumpkin patches and family values was replaced by a gritty, true crime narrative of witness tampering and felony charges. The social media reaction was an avalanche. The official Little People, Big World Facebook pages were flooded with millions of comments. Instagram accounts belonging to every member of the family were inundated. The fan base, once a relatively unified community, fractured violently. The vast majority of viewers rallied around Amy. She was instantly cast as the wrong party, the resilient matriarch who had endured years of disrespect only to be targeted by a vicious criminal plot. The hashtag #JusticeForAmy began trending. Her supporters left messages of love, encouragement, and outrage on her behalf. On the other side, the defense of Matt and Caryn was small but vocal, though it quickly dwindled. The few who tried to defend them were shouted down. How could you defend this? The evidence wasn't a rumor, it was a confession under oath. Matt Roloff, once seen as the ambitious, creative patriarch, was now being painted as either a fool who was duped by his partner or, worse, a co-conspirator who got caught. Caryn, who had always faced a degree of skepticism from the audience, was now vilified on a massive scale. She was no longer just the other woman. She was a felon, a cartoon villain who had tried to rig the justice system. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict long before a criminal court ever would, and it was a guilty verdict for Caryn, with Matt seen as an accessory either by action or by incompetence. While the world outside was erupting, the Roloff family was in lockdown. Roloff Farms, once a welcoming tourist destination, became a fortress. The front gates were chained shut with new "no trespassing" signs posted. Reports emerged of paparazzi using long-range lenses and even drones to try and get a shot of Matt or Caryn. They were prisoners in their own home, besieged by the scandal they had created. Inside that house, one can only imagine the atmosphere. The silence would have been deafening, punctuated by tense, whispered arguments and the constant ringing of phones from lawyers, publicists, and network executives. Our sources paint a picture of Matt Roloff in a state of complete collapse. The man whose entire identity was tied to his vision, his projects, and his control over his environment had lost control of everything. This was a problem he couldn't fix with a tractor or a new building. The prevailing theory from those close to the situation is that Matt was indeed kept in the dark about the specifics of Caryn's plan. He was a victim of his own desire to win and his trust in Caryn's ability to handle things. Now, that trust was shattered. He would be looking at the woman he loved and seeing a stranger, someone capable of a level of deception and criminality that he could never have imagined. The conversations would be agonizing. How could you do this, Caryn? How could you do this to me, to the family, to the farm? Caryn's state would be one of panicked damage control. The initial shock would have given way to the terrifying reality of her situation. She wasn't just in a public relations crisis. She was in legal jeopardy that could result in the loss of her freedom. Her first and most critical move would have been to hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney. We're talking about a high-priced shark of a lawyer from Portland, someone who specializes in high-profile cases. This lawyer's first piece of advice would have been unequivocal: say nothing to anyone, especially Matt. The lawyer would explain that anything Matt said could potentially be used against her and vice versa. They were no longer just partners. They were potential witnesses in each other's legal sagas. A wall of legal privilege would be erected between them, creating an emotional chasm that might never be bridged. Meanwhile, at Amy and Chris's house, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a sanctuary from the storm, but they were still at its center. Amy, while vindicated, reportedly took no joy in the downfall of her ex-husband's new life. She saw it as a profound tragedy, especially for her children. She was being hailed as a hero by the public, but she didn't feel like one. She felt exhausted and sad. Chris was her rock, fielding calls from well-wishers and shielding her from the worst of the media frenzy. Her lawyer's advice would have mirrored Caryn's, but for different reasons: stay silent. They had won. The truth was out. There was no need to give interviews or fan the flames. Any public statement would be carefully crafted and released through her legal team, expressing gratitude for the support while emphasizing her desire for privacy as the legal process unfolds. The focus now was on leveraging this incredible victory into a final, decisive settlement in the civil case. For the Roloff children, the scandal was a nightmare from which they couldn't wake. They were, in a sense, collateral damage. Their famous last name was now synonymous with crime and scandal. We are told they formed an unspoken, unified front of absolute science. Zach and Tori, already distant from Matt, would have retreated further. disabling comments on their social media and focusing entirely on their children, trying to create a bubble of normalcy in a world gone mad. The pain for Zach would be particularly acute, as he would have to one day explain to his own son, Jackson, why Grandpa's farm became the center of a criminal investigation. Jeremy and Audrey, who have built their entire brand on the concept of a strong, faith-based marriage and intentional living, would be in an incredibly awkward position. How do you preach about family values when your own family is imploding so publicly? Their response would likely be to post vague, inspirational quotes about overcoming adversity and finding strength in faith without ever directly addressing the scandal. It's a classic move of public figures in crisis. Speak without saying anything at all. Jacob, ever the family's conscience and critic, would likely feel a grim sense of vindication. He had long warned about the corrosive effects of fame and money on his family. This scandal would be the ultimate tragic embodiment of his fears. His public response might be a single cryptic tweet or Instagram story, something that conveyed his sorrow and his "I told you so" perspective without kicking his family when they were down. The corporate entity behind the family's fame, television network TLC, would have gone into full-blown crisis mode. Emergency meetings would have been held at the highest levels. The Roloff brand, a cornerstone of their programming for over 15 years, was now toxic. Their first public move would be a carefully worded statement. It would say something like, "TLC is aware of the serious allegations concerning the Roloff family. We are deeply troubled by these developments. Production on Little People, Big World has been suspended indefinitely to allow the family to navigate this difficult personal and legal matter in private." Behind the scenes, suspended indefinitely is corporate speak for canceled. There is no coming back from this. The show's premise is built on a foundation of family authenticity. With that foundation revealed to be riddled with lies and potential felonies, the entire structure is condemned. The network would begin the process of quietly scrubbing the Roloff presence from their promotional materials, and the show that had been a reality TV institution was, for all intents and purposes, dead. The paychecks would stop, the camera crews would be reassigned, and the Roloff era on TLC would come to an unceremonious and disgraceful end. Amid this public and private turmoil, the legal gears continued to grind. The first major event in the criminal track would be Caryn's arraignment. It would be a media circus. Caryn Chandler, accompanied by her expensive lawyer, would walk a gauntlet of cameras and shouting reporters on her way into the courthouse. Inside, she would stand before a judge, looking small and humbled as the formal charges were read aloud. Subornation of perjury, a Class C felony. Conspiracy to obstruct justice, a Class C felony. She would utter only 2 words, as coached by her lawyer, "not guilty." The judge would then set her bail, likely a significant amount given the severity of the crime, which Matt would have to pay, a bitter and expensive pill to swallow. She would be released on the condition that she have no contact with the witness, the farmhand, who was now the prosecution's star witness against her. Simultaneously, the civil case had to be resolved. Amy's lawyer, operating from a position of near absolute power, would have presented Matt's legal team with a final, non-negotiable settlement offer. It would be a take-it-or-leave-it deal designed to bring this entire sordid chapter to a close. The financial component would be massive, far greater than what Amy had originally asked for. It would reflect not only her true sweat equity, but also punitive damages for the malicious attempt to defraud her. But the terms would likely go beyond money. A key provision would almost certainly be a comprehensive and ironclad gag order. Matt and Caryn would have to agree to never speak publicly about Amy, the divorce, or the details of the settlement ever again. This would be Amy's way of ensuring her peace, of preventing them from ever trying to rewrite this history again. But the most significant and heartbreaking term, according to our sources, would concern the farm itself. Amy's team would argue that the property is now an irrevocably tainted asset, a symbol of the family's destruction. To truly move on, all ties must be severed. The settlement would mandate the sale of the entire Roloff Farms property to a third-party buyer within a specified time frame, with the proceeds to be divided according to the new Amy-favored terms. This would be Matt Roloff's ultimate defeat. To save Caryn from further legal exposure and to end the civil bleeding, he would be forced to sign the agreement. He would have to agree to sell his life's work, the legacy he had dreamed of passing down to his children. He would be giving up the one thing that had defined his entire adult life, not because of a business failure, but to pay for the consequences of his partner's crime. The signing of that document would be the true end of the Roloff dynasty. So, as this part of our story concludes, a new grim reality has set in. The show is over, the farm is being sold, the family is shattered, communicating only through lawyers, and Caryn Chandler, out on bail, is preparing for the fight of her life, a criminal trial that could send her to prison for years. The public thinks the outcome is a foregone conclusion. The evidence seems overwhelming, the confession of the farmhand a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. But her new legal team is working around the clock, digging into every aspect of the case, searching for a loophole, a mistake, any sliver of hope. And according to a whisper from a source close to her defense team, they believe they may have found one. They are working on a Hail Mary defense strategy, a radical and unexpected argument so audacious it could either exonerate Caryn completely or backfire so spectacularly it guarantees her a maximum sentence. The battle for Roloff Farms is over, but the war for Caryn Chandler's freedom is about to begin, and it promises to be even more shocking than the scandal that started it all. The legal system, contrary to what we see on television, does not move quickly. The weeks following Caryn Chandler's arraignment bled into months of excruciating quiet. The media storm subsided into a low, steady hum of speculation. The farm was put on the market, a silent, sprawling monument to a fractured family. For the public, the story felt like it was over. Caryn was out on bail, her guilt was widely assumed, and the trial was seen as a mere formality, a procedural step on the way to a conviction. Matt stood by her, a gaunt and isolated figure, the couple rarely seen in public. Their united front seemed more like two people clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a hurricane than a loving partnership. The prevailing question wasn't if Caryn would be found guilty, but for how long she would be sentenced. But behind the scenes, in the hushed, expensive offices of a top Portland law firm, a war was being planned. Caryn's lead defense attorney, a woman named Eleanor Vance, was not preparing for a plea bargain. She was not preparing for a surrender. Vance was a legal predator, known for her theatrical courtroom style and her almost supernatural ability to reshape a narrative. She understood that in a high-profile case, you are trying two juries, the one in the box and the one in the court of public opinion. She looked at the mountain of evidence against her client, the meeting, the money, the confession, and saw not an insurmountable obstacle, but a story that had been told incorrectly. Her job was not to deny the facts, but to hijack them, to twist them into a new shape, so compelling and so audacious that it would make the jury question everything they thought they knew. The first public signal of this new strategy came during the pre-trial motions. Vance filed a motion to compel discovery on a series of seemingly irrelevant topics. She demanded access to Roloff Farms employment records going back 15 years. She subpoenaed former farm employees, Most shockingly, she filed a motion to introduce evidence regarding Amy Roloff's managerial history and character. The prosecution was baffled and objected immediately. What did Amy's management style have to do with Caryn Chandler bribing a witness? The judge was skeptical, but in the interest of allowing the defense to build its case, he partially granted the motion, allowing limited inquiry. To the outside world, these were minor legal skirmishes. To insiders, it was the first tremor of an earthquake. Eleanor Vance wasn't defending Caryn. She was preparing to prosecute Amy. The day of the opening statements arrived. The courtroom was packed. This was the moment the public had been waiting for. The prosecution went first, laying out a simple, clear, and damning narrative. They told the story we all know. Caryn Chandler, desperate to win a civil case, found a disgruntled employee, paid him a large sum of cash to lie under oath, and was caught. The farmhand, their star witness, would testify to this. The bank records would prove the payment. The surveillance video would prove the meeting. The prosecutor concluded an open and shut case of a wealthy woman who thought she could buy her own justice. Then Eleanor Vance rose to her feet. She was poised, confident, and radiated an almost intimidating level of certainty. She walked slowly towards the jury box, made eye contact with each juror, and began to speak. And with her first few sentences, she detonated a bomb in the middle of the prosecution's case. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but firm. "The prosecution has just told you a story, a simple story, and like most simple stories, it is easy to believe. It is also almost entirely a lie." A murmur went through the courtroom. "They want you to believe that my client, Caryn Chandler, is a criminal mastermind, a felonious conspirator. They have painted her as a villain. Today, I am here to tell you the truth. And the truth is that Caryn Chandler is not the villain of this story. She is the one who tried to expose the villain. And the villain in this story is Amy Roloff." Gasps echoed in the gallery. Amy, sitting in the front row, recoiled as if she had been physically struck. Vance continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "For years," she boomed, "Amy Roloff ruled Roloff Farms with an iron fist. She was known to be vindictive, petty, and cruel to employees who dared to cross her. One of those employees was Mr. Farmhand. He was a good man, a hard worker. But he made the mistake of disagreeing with Amy Roloff, of pointing out her mismanagement. And for that, she had him fired. Not just fired, but humiliated. His reputation was ruined. He was left with nothing." Vance paced before the jury, weaving her new narrative. Years later, as this contentious civil trial began, Caryn Chandler started hearing whispers, rumors of Amy's past behavior. As a partner to Matt, she felt it was her duty to investigate. She sought out Mr. Farmhand, not to bribe him, but to listen to his story. And what she heard horrified her. She heard a story of incompetence and cruelty that was directly relevant to the farm's valuation. Mr. Farmhands had the truth, a truth he was terrified to tell. He was afraid of Amy Roloff. He was afraid of her lawyers, her money, her power. He said, I'll lose my current job. I can't afford to take the time off. I can't afford the backlash." "So Caryn Chandler," Vance said, her voice dropping to a compassionate near whisper, "did something heroic. She looked at this broken man and she said, 'Your truth needs to be heard. I will help you.' The money she gave him wasn't a bribe to lie. It was witness compensation. It was a hardship payment to cover his lost wages and travel expenses so that he could afford to come here and do his civic duty. It was a payment for his bravery." This was the Hail Mary, not to deny the facts, but to rebrand them. The secret meeting wasn't a conspiracy. It was a fact-finding mission. The cash payment wasn't a bribe. It was a compassionate assistance package. But Vance still had one massive hole to plug: the farmhand's own confession to the contrary. "So why," Vance asked rhetorically, Did this brave man get on the stand and confess to a lie? I will tell you why. Because he was ambushed and intimidated. Amy Roloff's high-priced pit bull lawyers got him on the stand, and they tore him apart. They threatened him with perjury charges. They twisted his words. They terrified him. And in a moment of pure panic, this simple working man did what any of us might do when faced with such overwhelming pressure. He told them what he thought they wanted to hear. He gave a false confession to make the bullying stop. But his original testimony, the one he gave in that deposition, that was the truth, and we will prove it. The impact of this opening statement was seismic. It didn't just challenge the prosecution's case, it turned it completely inside out. Suddenly, Amy Roloff was no longer the victim. She was the accused, a secret tyrant whose past was now the central issue of the trial. The farmhand was no longer a simple perjurer, but a confused, bullied victim. And Caryn Chandler was transformed from a scheming felon into a courageous whistleblower. The strategy was brilliant in its audacity. It explained all the evidence while recasting the roles of everyone involved. It was designed to create chaos and, most importantly, reasonable doubt. Could a jury really believe this? It seemed outlandish, but Vance's delivery was so convincing, so filled with conviction, that it planted a seed of uncertainty. For Amy, this was a fresh hell. She had endured the public humiliation of the divorce, the stress of the buyout, and the trauma of the false testimony. She had been vindicated by the confession, and she thought she could finally move on. Now, she was being dragged back into the mud. Her entire history on the farm, her relationships with her employees, her very character was about to be dissected and vilified in a criminal court, all as part of a desperate legal gambit to save the woman who had tried to ruin her. She looked over at Matt, who sat stone-faced behind the defense table, and saw not a confused ex-husband, but an active participant in her character assassination. By funding this defense, by sitting there and tacitly endorsing this strategy, Matt was co-signing this new, monstrous lie. Any lingering thread of their shared history, any remaining wisp of mutual respect, was incinerated in that moment. The trial was no longer a simple matter of proving a crime. It had become a war of narratives. The prosecution, once confident in their straightforward case, was now on the defensive. They had to not only prove that Caryn paid the witness, but they now had to reprove that Amy was the victim, that she wasn't the monster the defense was painting her to be. Eleanor Vance had successfully put Amy Roloff on trial. The jury looked back and forth between the two women, their faces a mixture of confusion and intrigue. The stage was set for a brutal, ugly legal war, where the truth itself was up for debate, and the final verdict was suddenly, shockingly, anyone's guess. The trial began, and it was nothing short of a legal street fight. Eleanor Vance's audacious opening statement had successfully transformed the entire narrative. This was no longer a simple case about a bribe. It was a psychological drama, a referendum on the character of everyone involved. The prosecution, led by a methodical but now clearly rattled deputy district attorney, was forced to play defense, their clean, simple case now mired in the mud of personal history and character assassination. The first key witness to take the stand was the farmhand himself, the man at the center of the storm. Under direct examination by the prosecutor, he was a pitiable figure. He recounted the story of Caryn approaching him, the offer of cash, and the script of lies he was told to deliver. He spoke softly, his eyes downcast. He explained that when he was confronted with the evidence of the meeting and the bank deposit, the guilt and the fear of a long prison sentence overwhelmed him, and he confessed. "I just wanted to make it right," he whispered, looking at the jury with pleading eyes. "I knew what I did was wrong." The prosecution rested, believing they had presented a sympathetic, repentant man who had been manipulated and was now telling the truth. Then Eleanor Vance stood up for her cross-examination, and the atmosphere in the courtroom turned glacial. She didn't attack him. She approached him with a predatory sort of sympathy. "Mr. Farmhand," she began, her voice dripping with compassion, "I want to talk about your time at Roloff Farms. It's true, isn't it, that you were fired in 2014? He mumbled that it was. "And it's true that it was Amy Roloff who personally pushed for your termination over what you felt was a minor disagreement." The prosecutor objected. Relevance. But the judge, having allowed this line of inquiry, overruled him. The farmhand admitted it was true. Vance then produced his termination file, reading from it, detailing Amy's written complaints about his insubordination and negative attitude. With every question, she painted a picture of a man who had been genuinely wronged by a vindictive boss. Then she pivoted to his confession. "When you gave that confession," she asked, "you were in a room with Amy Roloff's powerful legal team, correct? They told you that you were facing felony perjury charges, didn't they? They told you that you could go to prison for a very, very long time." The man nodded, looking increasingly distressed. "Were you scared, Mr. Farmhand? Were you terrified that your life was about to be ruined?" He whispered, "Yes." Vance moved in for the kill. "So in that moment of terror, you told them a new story, didn't you? A story that made them happy, a story that would make the threats go away. You implicated Miss Chandler to save yourself. Isn't that the truth?" The farmhand broke down, sobbing on the stand, mumbling, "I was confused. I don't know." It was a disaster for the prosecution. Vance hadn't proven her theory, but she had done something just as effective. She had rendered their star witness completely unreliable. He now looked like a man who would say anything to anyone to get out of trouble, making both his original testimony and his subsequent confession seem worthless. The next witness was Amy Roloff. This was the moment the trial had been building towards. When the prosecutor called her to the stand, she walked with a quiet dignity, a woman prepared to defend her life's work. On direct examination, she was a compelling and sympathetic witness. She described the 30 years she poured into the farm, the birth of pumpkin season, her role in building the business from the ground up. She described the shock and profound hurt of hearing the farmhand's lies in that deposition room. "It wasn't just about money," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was an attempt to erase my history, to erase me." Then it was Eleanor Vance's turn to cross-examine, and the courtroom witnessed a masterclass in character assassination. Vance was relentless, bringing up years of employee records, emails, and internal memos. "Ms. Roloff, do you recall a dispute in 2011 with your pumpkin patch manager over the placement of a hay bale maze? Is it true you overruled him and later wrote a disciplinary note in his file for questioning your judgment?" Amy, flustered, tried to explain the business context, but Vance cut her off. "Just a yes or no, Miss Roloff." The questions kept coming, each one small and seemingly petty on its own, but together they created a mosaic of a micromanaging, difficult, and imperious boss. Vance twisted Amy's business decisions into personal failings, her attention to detail into obsessive control, her firmness into cruelty. The defense attorney presented emails where Amy had used sharp language with vendors and staff. "That doesn't sound like the gentle farm mom from TV, does it, Miss Roloff?" Vance sneered. Amy tried to hold her ground. "I was a businesswoman, running a multi-million-dollar operation. Sometimes that requires being direct." But Vance had succeeded in her mission. She had shown the jury a different Amy Roloff, not the public persona, but a tough, sometimes abrasive business owner. It was just enough to plant the seed of doubt. Maybe Amy was hard to work for. Maybe the farmhand did have a legitimate grievance. Amy left the stand not as a clear-cut victim, but as a complex and, to some on the jury, unsympathetic figure. Matt Roloff watched the entire exchange without a flicker of emotion. his face an unreadable mask, a betrayal that was surely the deepest cut of all for Amy. Finally, in a move that shocked legal observers, the defense called Caryn Chandler to the stand. It was a massive gamble. Putting a defendant on the stand opens them up to a potentially devastating cross-examination. But Eleanor Vance knew her client's only hope was to sell her story directly to the jury. Dressed conservatively, Caryn looked meek and earnest. Vance led her through her rehearsed narrative with the skill of a film director. Caryn spoke of her deep love for Matt and her fear that Amy's legal demands would bankrupt him. She described her fact-finding meeting with the farmhand in a soft, caring voice. When Vance asked about the cash payment, Caryn began to cry. "He was in such a bad place," she wept, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. His family was struggling. He was so scared of what Amy's lawyers would do to him. It wasn't a bribe. I wanted to help. I wanted the truth to have a chance. It was a convincing performance, a desperate plea for empathy. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. He hammered her on the details. "Ms. Chandler, you have years of experience as a bookkeeper. Why was this witness compensation paid in untraceable cash in a secret meeting at a diner?" Caryn faltered, saying she was just being discreet. "Discreet or deceptive?" the prosecutor shot back. "If this was about helping a brave man tell the truth, why did you coach him on what to say? Why did you give him the specific phrases lazy and undermining Matt's vision?" Caryn denied coaching him, claiming they were just discussing his memories. The prosecutor presented cell phone records showing numerous calls and texts between her and the farmhand in the days leading up to the deposition. "Is this how a whistleblower behaves, Ms. Chandler? Or is this how a conspirator behaves?" With every question, the prosecutor chipped away at her performance, revealing the self-serving motive beneath the tears. By the end, Caryn looked exhausted and exposed, her story of compassionate assistance now seeming flimsy and contrived. The closing arguments were a perfect summary of the two warring narratives. The prosecution argued that the case was simple. The defense's story about witness compensation and a coerced confession was a ridiculous fantasy, an insult to the jury's intelligence. It was a clear-cut case of a wealthy woman who broke the law to get what she wanted and was now telling one last desperate lie to avoid the consequences. Eleanor Vance, in her closing, ignored the facts and focused on emotion and doubt. She painted Amy as a vengeful ex-wife and a corporate tyrant. She portrayed the farmhand as a pawn, a victim of both Amy's initial cruelty and her lawyer's intimidation. She held up Caryn as a flawed but ultimately well-intentioned woman who fought to protect the man she loved. "The prosecution has given you a simple story," Vance concluded, her voice ringing with passion. "But life and the people in this room are not simple. All I ask is that you look past their simple story and see the doubt about Amy Roloff's character, the doubt about the farmhand's confession. If you have even a sliver of that reasonable doubt, then you must find Caryn Chandler not guilty." With that, the case was handed over to the jury. 12 ordinary citizens filed out of the courtroom, their faces grim and unreadable. They held the future of Caryn Chandler and the final chapter of the Roloff family legacy in their hands. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Amy and Chris held hands, their faces etched with anxiety. Matt stared at the empty jury box, his empire already sold, his family in ruins, waiting to find out if the woman he had sacrificed it all for would be trading her life on the farm for a life in a prison cell. The wait for the verdict had begun. The wait was a unique form of torture. For Caryn, Matt, Amy, and Chris, the world shrank to the four walls of the courthouse and the endless agonizing crawl of the clock on the wall. The jury was out for what felt like an eternity. The first day of deliberations passed with no word. Then a second. The media camped outside the courthouse, running 24/7 coverage. interviewing legal experts who offered conflicting predictions. Inside, the silence was deafening. Caryn and Matt sat in a private conference room with their legal team, the air thick with unspoken fear. The bravado and confidence of the trial had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of the jury's power. Matt, we are told, was a ghost. He paced, he stared out the window, he barely spoke. He was a man who had already lost everything: his farm, his family unity, his public reputation. He was now facing the very real possibility of losing his partner to the prison system. The gamble, the audacious defense strategy, now seemed like a reckless bet made with the last of his chips. Was it brilliant, or was it a fatal mistake? In another part of the courthouse, Amy and Chris waited with her lawyer. For Amy, this was the final crucible. The trial had been a brutal ordeal, forcing her to listen to her life's work be dismantled and her character assassinated. Yet, she had held her head high. Now, all she could do was wait and pray that 12 strangers could see through the smoke and mirrors of the defense. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the final, official validation of the truth. It was about closing this chapter of her life so she could finally, truly be free of the farm and the ghosts that haunted it. Sources close to the jury deliberations have painted a picture of a deeply divided room. The initial vote, taken on the first day, was reportedly 7-5 in favor of conviction. Eleanor Vance's strategy had worked to a degree. 5 jurors had been swayed by her reasonable doubt narrative. They were hung up on the farmhand's shaky, contradictory testimony. How can we trust a man who has admittedly lied under oath multiple times? One juror reportedly argued. They debated Amy's character. She did seem like a tough boss, another mused. Maybe he was scared of her. But the 7 jurors in the majority held firm. Their argument was simple and powerful. Follow the money, the jury foreman, a retired accountant, was said to have repeated over and over. Forget all the drama. A secret meeting happened. A large sum of untraceable cash was exchanged. A false testimony was given. It's a straight line. Everything else is just noise. The battle raged for 3 long days. They rewatched the surveillance footage. They reread the bank statements. They pored over the transcript of Caryn's cross-examination, where her story of compassionate assistance had seemed to crumble under pressure. The turning point reportedly came on the 3rd day. The jurors decided to reenact the timeline of events on a large whiteboard. The meeting, the cash deposit, the phone calls, the deposition, the confession, the trial. Seeing it all laid out visually, the straight line became undeniable. The defense's narrative, for all its emotional power, required too many leaps of faith. You had to believe that a cash payment was just charity, that a secret meeting was just a chat, that the farmhand's confession was a lie, but his original testimony was the truth. It was too convoluted. The prosecution's story, on the other hand, was simple, logical, and supported by every piece of hard evidence. One by one, the holdouts began to change their minds. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a note was passed to the bailiff. The jury had reached a verdict. The call went out, and the key players reassembled in the courtroom. The tension was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on everyone. Matt and Caryn walked to the defense table, their faces pale and drawn. Caryn looked at Matt, her eyes pleading, and he reached out and took her hand. Amy and Chris took their seats, their expressions a mixture of hope and dread. The jury filed in, their faces stoic, deliberately avoiding eye contact with anyone. This was it. The court clerk took the verdict slip from the foreman. The rustling of the paper was the loudest sound in the world. She handed it to the judge, who read it silently, his expression unreadable. He then handed it back to the clerk. On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, the clerk began, her voice steady and clear. We, the jury, find the defendant, Caryn L. Chandler. She paused for a fraction of a second that stretched for an eternity. Guilty. A sharp, choked sob escaped from Caryn. Matt's hand holding hers went limp. He stared forward, his eyes glassy, his face completely devoid of expression, a man in a state of profound shock. The clerk continued, "On the charge of subornation of perjury, we, the jury, find the defendant." Another gut-wrenching pause. Guilty. It was over. The Hail Mary had failed. The audacious strategy had been rejected. The gamble had been lost. Caryn Chandler collapsed into her chair, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Eleanor Vance placed a hand on her shoulder, her face a grim mask of professional defeat. On the other side of the courtroom, Amy Roloff closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. Chris wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. It wasn't a cheer of victory, but a quiet, shuddering exhalation of a burden she had carried for far too long. The truth had finally won. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order as the gallery erupted in a roar of noise. He thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. He set a date for sentencing 6 weeks away. Eleanor Vance immediately requested that Caryn be allowed to remain free on bail pending sentencing, but given the severity of the felony convictions, the judge denied the request. He declared her a potential flight risk. The defendant will be remanded into custody, he ordered. The final horrifying moment had arrived. 2 sheriff's deputies approached the defense table. Caryn looked up at them, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. She looked at Matt, her eyes screaming a silent plea. But there was nothing he could do. He could only watch, helpless, as the deputies gently but firmly instructed her to stand and place her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of finality, the sound of a life irrevocably changed. As they led her away, a convicted felon, she looked back one last time at Matt Roloff, the man for whom she had risked everything. He didn't look back. He just sat there, a broken man, staring into the abyss that had once been his future, alone at the defense table, the sole remaining ruin of the Roloff empire. The courtroom drama was over, and the consequences were now brutally, undeniably real. The 6 weeks between the verdict and the sentencing were a somber, muted period. The media frenzy had passed, the legal arguments had been made, and all that remained was the grim finality of the judge's decision. For the Roloff family, it was a time of strange, suspended animation. The world had moved on to the next scandal, but they were still trapped in the wreckage. The day of the sentencing was a gray, overcast Oregon morning, the weather a perfect mirror for the mood. The courtroom was less crowded this time, the spectacle replaced by a somber sense of duty. Caryn Chandler was led in, no longer in a tailored suit, but in a standard-issue jumpsuit. The reality of her new life starkly apparent. She looked thinner, smaller, the fight gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out fear. Matt was there, sitting alone in the gallery, a solitary figure in a sea of empty benches. Amy and Chris were also present, not out of malice, but out of a need to see the story through to its absolute end. Eleanor Vance made a passionate plea for leniency. She painted Caryn as a first-time offender, a woman who had acted recklessly out of a misguided sense of love and loyalty. She spoke of Caryn's good character prior to this event, her community involvement, and the public humiliation she had already endured. She argued that prison was not the answer, that probation and community service would be a more just punishment. The prosecutor, in response, was unyielding. He spoke of the sanctity of the justice system. This was not a crime of passion, he argued, his voice firm. This was a cold, calculated attempt to corrupt the truth for financial gain. It was an assault on the very foundation of this court. To grant probation would send a dangerous message that if you are wealthy and well-connected, You can try to buy justice, and if you fail, you will walk away with a slap on the wrist. The system must have teeth. The sentence must serve as a deterrent. Then, the judge gave Caryn the opportunity to speak. She stood, her hands trembling as she read from a prepared statement. She apologized to the court, to her family, and in a moment that caused Amy to flinch, she turned and apologized directly to Amy Roloff. "I am deeply, deeply sorry for the pain I caused," she said, her voice cracking. "I was wrong. I was desperate, and I made a terrible mistake that I will regret for the rest of my life." Was it genuine remorse or a final, desperate performance for a lesser sentence? Only Caryn knew for sure. Finally, the judge delivered his sentence. He spoke of the gravity of the offense, calling it a cancer on the judicial process. He acknowledged her lack of a prior record, but emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime. "This court," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "must send an unequivocal message." He sentenced Caryn Chandler to a term of 3 to 5 years in the state correctional facility. A gasp went through the room. It was a firm, significant sentence. The judge's gavel fell, and with that final, percussive sound, the legal saga of Roloff Farms was officially over. As deputies led a now weeping Caryn away, Matt Roloff finally stood up. He didn't look at Caryn. He didn't look at Amy. He simply turned and walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders slumped, a man utterly defeated. He walked past the few remaining reporters, saying nothing, his face a blank mask of grief, and disappeared into a waiting car, a lonely king exiled from his own fallen kingdom. 1 year later, the world turns and seasons change, even on a farm without a family. 1 year after the sentencing, the landscape of the Roloff world is unrecognizable. Caryn Chandler is an inmate at the state's women's correctional facility. The designer clothes have been replaced by a prison uniform. Her days are a monotonous, rigid routine of head counts, work assignments in the laundry, and evenings in a small shared cell. Reports from inside suggest she is a quiet model prisoner, keeping to herself. Matt's visits, frequent at first, have become sporadic, then almost non-existent. The chasm created by her crime and the prison walls themselves has proven too wide to bridge. Their love story, which began amidst the pumpkin patches and ended in a courtroom, is now just a collection of fading memories whispered over a static-filled prison phone line. Matt Roloff lives a life of quiet isolation. He sold the farm as mandated by the settlement. He couldn't bear to see it go to strangers, so he accepted a lucrative offer from a corporate winery consortium. Where the pumpkin patch once stood, rows of grapevines now stretch towards the horizon. The whimsical structures, the pirate ship, and the western town were bulldozed, deemed liabilities by the new owners. Matt kept the big house and a few surrounding acres, a small island of memories in a sea of corporate agriculture. He rattles around in the empty rooms, a ghost in his own past, tinkering with projects that have no audience, building things for a future that will never come. The estrangement from his children, deepened by his support of Caryn's disastrous trial strategy, is now a permanent, silent fixture in his life. He is a wealthy man who has never been poorer. Amy and Chris, on the other hand, are thriving. They are truly free. The massive settlement afforded them complete financial independence. They sold their own house and have spent the better part of the last year traveling the country in an RV, living the life they always dreamed of. Amy's Instagram is filled with pictures of them smiling in front of national parks and scenic vistas. She rarely speaks of the farm or the trial. She has moved on, not by forgetting the past, but by building a future so bright it casts no shadows. The vindication she received was not in the verdict, but in the peace she has finally found. The Roloff children have also found their own peace, far from the wreckage of their parents' war. Zach and Tori's family has grown, and their life is a happy, chaotic world of their own making, one that revolves around their children, not their father's legacy. Jeremy and Audrey continue to build their own brand, their focus firmly on their own farm and their own version of a perfect life. Molly remains happily private, and Jacob continues to advocate for his own passions, finding his truth far from the cameras that he believes contributed to his family's downfall. The siblings are, by all accounts, closer than ever, bonded by the shared, unspoken tragedy of losing the farm and, in many ways, their father. And so the story ends. The Great Roloff Farm, once a symbol of a unique family's American dream, is gone. The television show that brought them into our homes is a distant memory. It is a cautionary tale, a saga of how a foundation built on love and sweat equity can be brought down by greed, jealousy, and one desperate criminal act. It's a reminder that the stories we see on TV are often just that, stories. The reality is always far more complex and sometimes far more tragic. Thank you for joining us here at LPBW Update for this in-depth look into one of the most shocking stories in reality television history. It's a story we will continue to follow as new developments emerge. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future updates. And let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think is the ultimate lesson from the rise and fall of the Roloff dynasty? Until next time, take care.